Right, so we've gone on a little journey today. You know, we started out with safety and COVID testing. We had some, wide-eyed dreamers on the stage wondering why and how, and if it is possible for psychedelics to do things differently.
Just met Ryan Zar.
We went a little technical. We had a lot of talk about structuring and building, and if you have decided that you want to enter this field and you want to build something and you grow it, and you're interested in doing some things in a way that's less than conventional but perhaps more purpose-aligned, to have the tools to be able to do that. We had a nice long lunch break, which I'm glad we did. There's a lot of content here, but it's also important to socialize. And now, this afternoon, we are back, and we are going to get to the fun stuff, because we are about to talk about money. And so everyone knows, after we get done talking about money, we are going to hear from some people who have done all of the things you've heard about today, where they've decided that they're very interested in psychedelics, that they want to do something in a way that is with integrity. They're willing to make the leap, do so in a less than conventional way, that they hope will fulfill their vision and become sustainable, and that they to find a way to do it and raise money, and at the end, the stage is going to look like a huge boy band with all of these different people doing amazing stuff on the stage. We're going to hand a microphone around. We don't have word yet from the tech department whether they convert this whole situation into a karaoke machine or not. We can do White Rabbit or something. Maybe at the end of the day as a group we'll have a sing-along for the big ending photo. But for now, to kick off our discussion about money, it is my pleasure to introduce North Star co-founder and a partner at Mayfield, Tim Chang.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for being here. I just want to kind of share a personal story. This is a really special moment for me because, 3 years ago, Liana, Kat Cannar, Dave McGaughey, Sherelle Noble, and I would sit around brainstorming this topic and what North Star could be. And this conference is a realization of that dream. Got postponed by COVID, but it's really beautiful to see it realized. And part of what we wanted to set out to do was to find ways to do business for better, in this field, while recognizing that we have constraints and realisms of market economies and funding pressures, but really also drill into the best practices and ask the tough questions on how do we really do this? How do we build business for better? But for this session, Catalytic Capital, which is a term I first heard from David Bronner as we were trying to assemble this sort of like round table of investors who got the download, so to speak, and wanted to walk that talk. A lot of it is, all right, everything roots from money. So how do we fund, fuel, and govern these so-called businesses for better, right? Something I've always been fond of saying is that to understand the actions of any individual in any moment, just look at their core patterns of trauma and wounds. To understand the actions of an organization, look at their business model, see where the dollars flow, and you'll understand all of it. And with that is a recognition that money isn't just green, it's not just a commodity. All funding carries energy, intention, and agenda behind it. So money isn't equal. If you want to understand the pressures, the hooks behind that funding, look at the source of that money. What are their expectations? What are their timelines? What returns they need to see? Because that pressure will drive how those investors, how those founders, how the workers, how the community kind of receives that energy, right? And so my personal mission is to see how do we drive a better form of capitalism going here. Is it maybe a hybridization of for-profit and nonprofit? And that's my dream, is to see for-profits have more of the conscience of nonprofits. Nonprofits to have maybe more of the operating know-how and the best practices, the resources of for-profits, right? And with Catalytic Capital, this all sounds great on paper, but how do we put this into practice? And so I'm really honored to have some of the best practitioners and pioneers here on stage to show and talk about how to actually put this into practice. There's going to be a whole lot of performative virtue signaling. There's going to be a whole lot of token concessions, greenwashing in this field as it starts to look cool to do this. But we really need to ask the tough questions. And so as moderator, I'll do that at the end. But I'm really excited for each of you to talk about the how and the what, the mechanics of how to make this vision come true. So I think with that, we're going to kick off with Kevin. Grab the little quick intro here. Kevin Bayuk is Impact Investment Strategist at RiverStyx Foundation and the worker-owner of Lift Economy. Kevin Bayuk works at the intersection of ecology and economy, where permaculture design meets next economy organizations intent on meeting human needs while enhancing the conditions conducive to all life. Kevin?
Thank you, Tim. Do I have it? Can everybody hear me? Great. No? A little bit louder? Hold it here. Better. Okay.
Do you want me to stand with
That's okay. Well, Jenny and I are actually going to talk together. We're colleagues. So I thought I'd start with a little bit more of a backdrop for this conversation, especially given that I get the privilege of working with the RiverStyx Foundation. RiverStyx Foundation has been a philanthropic supporter of this space for over a decade, along with David Bronner, and funding preclinical and clinical trials, over a decade ago, really helped set the stage for what Liana described this morning, which is kind of a strange moment, this explosive growth. By our tracking, we saw maybe 4 years ago, about $2 million of private venture equity investment in this space broadly, and this year we're tracking above 500 million. So in terms of, in a catalyst of speeding up the reaction, I think philanthropy as one form of mechanism for funding a space definitely has proven itself as catalytic. However, I do want to mention the intentions of the David Bronners, the RiverStyx Foundation, and the Carrie Turnbulls. They kind of came to this space with curiosity, but in a spirit of service and a commitment to the healing and transformative potential of these medicines and therapies. I think that the big question now is, can we be catalytic for those outcomes, for those healing outcomes, and even transformative outcomes? And I think there's some questions that we might want to ask ourselves, and RiverStyx asks these questions. Examples, being really sensitive to, here a lot of the promise for these compounds and medicines that you're all working on is to treat mental health. When we think about mental health, I think it's important to consider what are the root causes of the mental health crisis. And so we might look at things like colonization, capitalism, climate change, and of course, and the racial wealth gap. So many of the core drivers of the mental health crisis, I think it's very important to pause and ask ourselves if the way we fund the growth of this space, will they heal the root causes, or will they exacerbate the root causes and actually contribute to the growing mental health crisis? And so we think of business as usual finance. There's both structural elements and cultural elements, and I want to give a little bit of backdrop as a preamble into looking at the mechanisms of innovation, and I'm going to let Jenny kind of explore those in a moment. But some of the questions that I would ask for those of you who are funders to see if these are beliefs or assumptions that you hold. One assumption I hear frequently is that scale can only be achieved by enterprise and capitalism. I think it's worthwhile questioning that. I think the statistic I read recently from a study was that over 20% of American adults between the ages of 17 and 64 have tried or are using psychedelic medicine in some form or another. Maybe not as medicine, but in some type of pro-social, for some type of outcome. All startups are high risk, and therefore investing in them requires or deserves an outsized return. I think there is differentiation that is important to recognize, in that maybe drug development and going through clinical trials and FDA approval requires a lot of capital and probably is a high-risk pharma game, but is that true for community clinics that are providing point-of-care services? Should they be on the same timelines for liquidity and growth mandates? So actually differentiating the forms of capital for the different types of enterprise might be a really important consideration. Another belief system that I hear is that any and all compromises that happen in the operations of business. This might be higher prices for medicine, lower standards of care for therapy, are necessary to compete in our capitalist society. You won't have a viable business if you make those compromises. And I think those are also important considerations to look at. Is that the mandate of capital and the promises to limited partners in a fund, and what the expectations of capital are? Is that driving that cynicism? Or is that just categorically true? It's not the role of enterprises to share benefits or to create reciprocity initiatives. I hear that the purpose of an enterprise is to do business, not to create benefit or impact. I think that's something that we can deeply consider, and a lot of the speakers earlier today have talked about structural ways to encode benefit and impact into the organization. And then finally, and I'll pass it over to Jenny here, I oftentimes hear that there's no alternative to the standard funding models. These are the tools that we have. And I could try and characterize those, but I think Tim set it up well, that we have a lot of capital is driven by these expectations, liquidity timeframes, market rate return, risk-adjusted return kind of calculations that come from sometimes other industries or other norms. And I think there are alternatives, and Jenny and I will discuss them in a moment, but there's not a broad awareness yet. So Jenny, do you want to lead it? Is that okay, lead into some of the alternatives?
Thank you. Stay standing. So yeah, I was super excited to co-present with Kevin today because we've been working together for years to try to grow the ecosystem of creative funding models that can really support a diverse array of businesses. We're not about any kind of cookie cutter approach. We just think it's so important that every business get funding that is completely customized to their particular goals, values, mission. So I'm an attorney. I kind of fell into being a securities lawyer about 15 years ago. I was really passionate about supporting small businesses, and I started to learn about the huge lack of capital that most businesses have. Even though in the United States there are trillions and trillions of dollars invested by Americans, over 50% of Americans are invested in something, almost all of that money is invested in the global capital markets, in the public companies, which make up less than 1% of all the businesses in our country. And so for most businesses, there really isn't a lot of good options for having capital. So I got really passionate about that, and I found out about securities law, which is the law that governs how businesses are allowed to raise money. And it really is one of the big barriers to access to capital, because that area of law is very antiquated, complicated. Very few attorneys really know all the different options that are available. So I sort of fell into that, and I started helping entrepreneurs raise money. And even though I lived in the heart of Silicon Valley, I was kind of out of the loop on the Silicon Valley style of funding. I had been at a nonprofit, so I didn't know what is the right way to fund a startup. So I just started getting clients and figuring out how to help them raise money. And one of my very first clients was a startup grocery store. And it was a very mission-driven grocery store wanting to create a really wonderful, high-quality grocery store that would eventually be worker-owned in West Oakland. And the person who founded it had spent a year trying to raise money by going to pitch competitions and angel investing groups, and he hadn't raised any money, which really isn't a big surprise because those types of investors generally aren't going to fund a grocery store. They fund high-tech, high-growth startups. Usually that's the model. That's what they invest in. So we decided to work together to allow him to raise money from the community. So we did something called, back then we called it direct public offerings. Now we now call it investment crowdfunding. We did it under state law because it wasn't yet legal under federal law, and he ended up raising about $1.7 million from the community. And what he offered, I'm not about just where the money comes from, I'm also about what does the term sheet say. We heard a lot of great things about that in the last panel. I feel like the term sheet is going to tell you, is this a socially just arrangement or not? And he designed the term sheet. He knew best what to offer to investors because he knew what his goals and mission and values were. So he designed a term sheet where he offered non-voting preferred stock with a dividend. And there's a possibility of an exit eventually. So if someone wants to exit from their investment, they can request to exit. However, they can only get back the same amount they put in. So he was able to raise $1.7 million that way, which leveraged some other funding, and the grocery store is now open. And I just want to give a couple other quick examples of some creative ways that people have been raising money. There's something called TechSoup, which is a nonprofit, and they just finished raising, I think, $11.5 million. They're a nonprofit organization, but they offered an investment opportunity. A nonprofit can't offer an equity investment, but they offered a debt investment. And they did it under Regulation A, which is a new tool that's available. Actually, it's an old tool, but it's been updated. It's a tool that allows you to raise money, again, from your community. And they raised $11.5 million that way. And then I just want to say, I hear from a lot of people who are doing service-based businesses, oh, I could never raise money from investors because, I'm a service-based business, that, no one would invest in that. So I just want to share that I personally decided, after having helped a few entrepreneurs raise money, I decided to try to raise money for my own business, which was a law firm. And so I ended up offering an investment opportunity. It's not legal to offer equity in a law firm to non-lawyers, but I offered a debt-based instrument. It's revenue-based debt. So the payment is dependent on the revenues of the company. And we ended up raising $200,000 for a law firm. So those are just a few examples. I'm happy to share many, many more. There's so many opportunities and options available. And I really do believe that the key is opening up the opportunity to more people, not just focusing on the quote unquote usual suspects of who we think of when we think of who are investors. As I said before, over 50% of people in our country are investors. I'm raising money for a project right now, and I've raised several $100,000, and none of our investors are people that would probably call themselves an investor. They're just regular folks with regular jobs, and they have invested in our business because they believe in it. And they're, if you just go after that small group of people who are what we call professional investors, which I include in that to be active angel investors, venture capitalists, people who manage funds, people who manage professional offices. Those investors only make up 0.3% of the total population of investors in the United States. So I highly recommend not limiting yourself to that tiny pool and going after that larger pool of potential investors. Those folks tend to be a lot more flexible, and if they're not investing other people's money, they can be a lot more open to creative structures.
Thanks, Jenny. So I have a question for you in a moment, but I want to build off the creativity that's possible in term sheets. That, again, there is alternatives, they're just not super common yet. There are alternatives. An example, RiverStyx Foundation made an investment into an organization that provides kind of point-of-care services. It's actually out of country, but with regards to psychedelic medicine therapy. And the investment was structured with both a revenue-based component, but it actually had a trigger or a hurdle such that an IRR hurdle. And once it achieved a certain IRR or return, internal rate of return, that then the investment was done. So both had a cap ultimate return, total return, so giving patience to the investment terms, as well as saying, once we've got the return that we're looking for, we've hit our threshold, that's enough. And so baking in these types of clauses, caps, or redemption terms are things that are emerging, but it's not okay to say that they're not possible. The alternatives do exist. Now, I imagine there's some investors here who might be like, that's all fine for a community-based clinic. I see how they're providing services, they're generating revenue, so revenue-based financing might make sense. But what about this drug development where you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in order to get over your FDA approval process? And I'm wondering, Jenny, if you could maybe just say a little bit about what the limits are of Reg A. Not to say that Reg A is going to solve everything, but I think a lot of people don't know that you actually can raise a lot of capital. Do you want to share a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah, and I'm glad you brought up there's something called structured exits, which is kind of and I think it was probably mentioned in the last panel. The last panel covered so much of what we were planning to cover, so we're kind of going off the cuff here. But yes, so there's so many ways that investors can exit from their investment without you having to sell your business. So this is an example of how that can happen. But in terms of raising large large amounts. I think there is a belief out there that if you have to raise a very, very large amount, hundreds of millions of dollars, you have to go to those usual suspects. And I just really push back on that idea. I mean, there are trillions and trillions of dollars invested by Americans. I don't understand why we can't access large amounts of money using these kinds of strategies. So in terms of Regulation A, so Regulation A plus, which just became legal in the last few years, that does allow you to do a crowdfunding campaign and raise up to $75 million. There's actually a really great business that's using that right now. I mentioned TechSoup had used that. Their offering is closed, but there's another business that's currently raising under that called East Bay Real Estate Cooperative, East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. I know if you happen to go to a website that I'm involved with called crowdfundmainstreet.com, you can find their offering there, so you can look at it. So there's other ways to find it too, but I know it's there. They're using Regulation A+, and they've gone through the whole process of dealing with the Securities and Exchange Commission and doing all the filings, and really it wasn't that difficult. I mean, it's a somewhat onerous process because you need to do a lot of disclosures and get approval from the Securities and Exchange Commission, but they've done it and they've raised, I don't know where they're at now, but they're doing pretty well.
And what's the limit now? The updated limit is like
75 million, yeah.
Each year, right? Is that
right, you can keep going back, yeah.
So alternatives do exist, and I think this idea of, I think it's even poetic that there could be redemption possible for investors. This idea of the redemption clauses that could be built in so that we could actually exit. Because in the opportunity for transformation to actually address the root causes of the mental health crisis, I think we actually need to be talking about transforming capitalism and addressing things like climate change. And those seem like orthogonal conversations in the room where we're talking about the development of psychedelic medicines and therapy. But ultimately, we should aim for all of the organizations that we're starting in this industry to die. To end. What I mean by that is that we've actually addressed mental health so that the root causes are addressed so that we don't need to exist anymore. And you can ask yourself what kind of funding and funding mechanisms would actually set up an organization so that it doesn't need to exist in perpetuity. And so that's where this creativity and term sheets and all these alternatives, I think, can play a role in a North Star vision for an industry.
Yeah, I think we can stop there so there's more time for Q&A.
We're feeling redundant. There's a lot shared earlier that was amazing on the other panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Next up, I have the pleasure of introducing Bobbi Dunphy, Director of Impact, Legacy Global, and Chief Advisor at Enthea. Bobbi is an Australian social entrepreneur, angel investor, and mentor living in San Francisco who has worked at the nexus of water, food, energy, and climate security for the past 20 years. Bobbi.
Hi all. Lovely to see you all here, and I'm honoured to be on this panel with this amazing crew. I'll be really straight up. I'm not a natural public speaker, so I'm going to be expressing radical transparency to say that I'm actually in a place where I feel a little bit afraid. So just bear with me as I go down this path. As mentioned, I'm on a board trustee of Pivotal Growth and the director of Impact at Legacy Global. I'm also chief advisor to Enthea, and I think you might have heard about Enthea earlier this morning. I'm also on the board of the Centre for Environmental Health. And when I thought about what I was going to speak to today in the 10 minutes that I had, I thought about creating a PowerPoint to blow everyone away. And then I thought, no, I'm not going to speak so much about the what, but I'm going to speak to the why and why I'm doing this work that I'm doing currently. So I came out of the womb with an acute sense of social justice. And ever since I can remember, I've actually wanted to try and level the playing field to enable people to reach their fullest potential, because I don't think we'll have a healthy, thriving society until we do that. And as Tim mentioned, I've worked at the intersection of climate, food, energy, and financial security for decades now. And with that comes a deeply steep knowledge of crisis management. So I have been thinking about how we solve for the big global challenges and the existential crises that we face. And it's not lost on me that we're experiencing an ecological crisis at the very same time that we're experiencing crisis of meaning. And so many have lost their way and their connection to themselves and to society, and are experiencing both climate anxiety and deep trauma. And I think COVID has really brought that out. And what we're seeing now are the repercussions of that. And I don't think we're anywhere near through that. I think we're going to be seeing those repercussions come further and deeper. And in my case, I found the last 18 months to be the most challenging of my entire life. And I had to deploy every single tool in my toolkit to actually navigate my way through. I lost 22 of the people that I cared about, including my sister, Dr. Kim Dunphy, OAM, and my equally amazing brother-in-law, CEO of Marriott Hotels and board member of Microsoft. I lost friends. I lost, I was with people that lost their children. It's been a very, very tough time, and I'll be honest. I've been on my knees, and it got me thinking: how is anyone who doesn't have the tools that I've accumulated getting through this period? Because I have a lot of tools, and I was thinking about how do we disseminate those tools going forward? Because the key thing for the mental health crisis and the other crises we face, climate being the meta issue of our time, I believe, is that unless we actually upskill with resiliency and adaptability, we're not going to be able to face the crisis that we have currently and going forward and what's coming down the pike. And I see psychedelic medicines as one tool in the toolkit. And again, I see that around crisis management and what we can be using. I mean, it's hard to imagine a brighter world without being able to see your way forward, as we all know. So when people ask me what I'm working on currently, I talk about the fact that I'm working at the intersection of climate, psychedelic medicines, and finance. And some people get that. Some people in this room would get that, and many need greater explanation. And so, in my opinion, I don't think we're going to solve for the big global challenges that we face until we solve for the crisis of consciousness. And I don't mean that in any sort of woo-woo hippie way. I'm being really pragmatic. I really don't think we're going to do that. And we're at a critical moment in time, as we all know. And there's deep societal trauma. And until we solve for deep societal trauma, we won't solve for the other crises. So I've been thinking about the most efficient hack in how we upgrade the planetary operating system. And we need a high-functioning society. And with that, the speed of trust, which I think we all really understood better during COVID and as we're experiencing now. And with that is a deep sense of the foundation of trust so that people can actually relate and move forward more quickly with what they need to be doing. In relationship to the theme of catalytic funding, I was lucky enough to be invited to an off-site board meeting with MAPS in February 2020. And it was the very last in-person meeting that I went to, and it was incredibly fortuitous. Because on that day, they brought in all of their ecosystem partners, all the amazing people that work to actually build out the care delivery infrastructure of the psychedelic medicine industry. And there were extraordinary people in that room, some of them on the panel here and others in the room here. And I just felt very honored. And I thought about the way that I could bring my skill set and be of service to this community. And so what I looked at was how we actually map this ecosystem and what the gaps are. And for me, the biggest gap was access to funding. There is a lot of capital moving into this space, but it's around the actual colour of that capital and the intentionality behind that. and also how that's being deployed and into what. And so the financial part of the intersection of climate and psychedelic medicines, I actually was thinking about ways in which we can actually be a little bit more innovative with philanthropy. And I can't understand why there's money sitting on the sidelines not being put to use right now. It bewilders me. But there are billions of dollars sitting in donor advised funds on the sidelines and in private foundations. And let's face it, there's a lot of wealthy people on the planet that could be doing more than they are. So with that, I actually set out to build a financial instrument called Pivotal Growth. And I'm doing that with Ron Boehm from the Boehm Foundation and Melody Dunphy from Legacy Global. And we actually built out a charitable trust, 501c3, and we're actually moving capital off the sidelines from donor advised funds and investing directly into both climate and psychedelic medicines. With that, we are actually also doing recoverable grants. So this is an evergreen fund, and we're looking to recycle this capital so it just doesn't get pissed to the wind, for want of a better term. I'm Australian. We use that term. So with that, we are actually looking at ways in which we can actually support those entities that are actually are actually having a positive impact on the planet. And with that, I actually spent a lot of time with Melody Dunphy at Legacy Global. And Legacy Global is a donor advised fund sponsor platform that's actually actively moving capital off the sidelines, and they're not nervous or scared to put it into both climate and psychedelic medicines, which is highly unusual for donor advised funds. We work with people that are coming into liquidity events and others that have got resources to put to work, and we work with them around their tax liabilities and create innovative mechanisms for their philanthropy. And steering the ship towards psychedelic medicines is a big part of my focus. I also work with family offices. I work with the principals and next-gen members of family offices, and I help them understand how they can align their philanthropic giving and investment capital with their own specific value sets. Additionally, after surveying the land and the ecosystem, I've joined Enthea as a chief advisor. And I'm sure you all heard Leah speak this morning, Leah Mix, the amazing Leah Mix. But what Enthea is doing is actually bringing the first ever medical insurance coverage to the psychedelic medicine industry, and with that democratizing access to the medicines. I'm actually heading up the Access Enthea, which is the philanthropic arm. It's a 501c3. And with that, we're building out patients' assistance funds for those that fall through the cracks. And we're doing so to actually white label that for organisations and individuals that want to actually see the demographic that they care about to get access to funding in order to get access to patients' assistance care, and therapy. With that, we're looking at those arenas that include formerly incarcerated members of the community and their families, black and brown communities, Indigenous elders that are left behind, the list goes on. So we're also building out a general pool fund from which that we will actually be investing into entities in the psychedelic medicine arena, and we're going to be doing that through that pooled fund via the 501c3 to ensure that we can actually get those innovative groups that are doing work within the care delivery infrastructure to go to scale. Now, the main reason I joined Enthea is because I care about access to these medicines. Currently, this is an elite sport, let's face it. And the gap between those who have access to these medicines and those that don't is very, very wide. So we're making a concerted effort to also build reciprocity into everything we think about at the core of it, and we're doing everything in our power to close the gap to provide access to care. So I invite you all to do the same so that we can level the playing fields enable people to take agency of their own lives and become more adaptable and resilient, and truly help build a more highly functioning society and ultimately a more thriving planet. We're all in this together, and we're all connected. And as John Muir would say, when one tugs at a single thing in nature, we find it hitched to the universe. We have a chance to get this right, so I'd love you all to join us and try and let's steward this in a very thoughtful way together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bobbi. Next up, we have Steve Jurvetson, who's Managing Director and Founder of Future Ventures. Steve is an early-stage VC with a focus on founder-led, mission-driven companies at the cutting edge of disruptive technology and new industry formation. He's backed pioneering companies such as Enthea, Osmind, Planet, SpaceX, and Tesla. Steve, care to share your thoughts on funding for growth?
Thank you. Happy to, Tim. I'll stand up so you can see me in the back. Can you hear me okay? Good. Raise your hand if somewhere through this process I'm not a singer by habit, so I don't know how to hold the thing. Yes, so I'll be primarily speaking as a venture capitalist today, but I should start just with a disclaimer to say that most of Genevieve, my wife, and I's involvement in this field from a catalytic funding point of view is on the nonprofit side. We were donors to MAPS and VETS, and more recently some ballot initiatives through PSFC. And I mean, I can't think of a better form of catalytic philanthropy than in the psychedelic science world. This is something Tim Ferriss believes strongly in, and so do we, that like rarely do you see the opportunity to have such an enormous potential impact as, let's say, our early support of MAPS to try to get, you know, the first federally approved psychedelic therapy through the FDA cycle. It's just, it makes my skin tingle to think about that potential leverage. And so I just want to mention, A, that's been our primary focus, and B, it's the majority of our dollars. I have, as mentioned, invested professionally at work through Future Ventures and Enthea and then Osmind. And for those who don't know Osmind, it's something I think is going to become more important, which is software and systems for healthcare practitioners and mental health clinics, ketamine clinics, alternative providers, to track outcomes in the real world, both for research purposes, for patient health, and to have statistics in Oregon and elsewhere of how many people are being cured for those that occasionally have, let's say, a relapse. Hold it higher up. Okay. Like Lady Gaga? Yeah, oh, Jesus. This feels so unnatural. Okay, I'll try. One other point is I don't think it's one or the other. You've heard some alternative financing modalities make a lot of sense. Philanthropy makes a lot of sense. Venture capital itself is changing, as are the companies that we invest in, and that's what I'm going to focus my time on. But I do want to point out one interesting, almost catalytic loop that occurs, in that many of the entrepreneurs that we fund feel empowered because of the work MAPS or a ballot initiative have sort of given them the freedom to speak, if you will, freely, without fear of being judged. Or similarly, if you look at a ballot initiative, the chances that it would pass is probably highly influenced by the results from clinical trials that MAPS and Compass and others are pushing through that show that this is some of the most efficacious therapy ever conceived for mental health. Right? That helps a ballot initiative be more than just, you know, some hippie thing. It has, you know, obvious profound benefits for humanity. Okay, so on the investment side, so just with those preambles, they've asked me to talk about the venture side of my business. It's all that other stuff that excites me as well. So on the venture side, I'm what you might call an impact investor. Although it's not baked into our, the constraints of our documents, it's where I find we can make the most money and do the most good. So as an investor over decades, it's not just profit maximization. That tends to be short term. And if I've learned anything from Tesla, SpaceX, and Planet, for example, it's that founder-led, mission-driven businesses, frankly, are better businesses to invest in if your ultimate goal is to make money over the long term being decades, not years. And there's a variety of reasons I've come to appreciate why that's true, right? If you're an employee, you know, a really talented engineer, you want to work for a company that's going to help the world. It's sort of obvious, right? You want a mission you believe in. If you are a regulator, a person from the press, a customer, you are rooting for Tesla, you're rooting for these companies to achieve their mission, especially if you understand the mission and if you agree with it and if it's going to help the world. So in a long-winded way, what I'm saying is if you compare a company A that just says, I am here to maximize shareholder value, this thing that we were told in business school you're supposed to do, I actually think that is ultimately self-defeating. Not only will you, on a process perspective, not get the best and brightest people to join you and the best customers and the evangelists and what have you, versus another company that does it a different way. You also, frankly, as you scale, will have trouble coordinating the efforts of your team. What I mean by that, imagine a Tesla or a SpaceX, when they were 10 people, 100 people, maybe everyone could coordinate what are the priorities of du jour, right? When you're thousands of employees, you need a mission to align around things like, what are we doing this quarter towards the mission? Take in contrast again, the profit-only company. You will have bitter debates till the end of time of something that could be done to maximize profits this quarter or this year or this decade, and they are often very opposed to one another, right? Investments made today for the long term trade off with short-term profitability. This is why large companies tend to be sclerotic and running somewhat on autopilot and become a lot less nimble than the young companies who have a mission. The big companies without a mission, frankly, are lost, and I would bet against them in the long run. The other reason we like, again, it's an and, not a or, some of these purpose-driven businesses as a vector of change in areas where you want to catalyze change is, frankly, for some of the big, hairy problems of the world, it is almost always a new entrant that leads the change. So we heard about climate. We think about psychedelic science, or mental health maybe more precisely. How can we make improvements in mental health, a field that's had almost no improvement over the last 30 years, right? How can you make radical change? And it will never be an incumbent, right? It won't be, don't blame the big pharma companies for failing to innovate. Don't expect any big company to innovate, right? Think about an automotive industry company, any of them 20 years ago. They weren't thinking about electric cars. They weren't pushing this agenda forward. If Tesla had failed and gone bankrupt, they would have just smugly gone on with business as usual. And you know that today, there would be very little initiative to get rid of gas-burning cars. You wouldn't have countries like Germany putting a sunset provision on gas-burning cars. That would not have happened but for Tesla. Right? So if you want to catalyze a change in an industry, you can't expect the incumbents who make money off the old-fashioned way to lead the charge. They'll be a fast follower at best, teetering on bankruptcy if the change is disruptive enough. You see that in aerospace with SpaceX, you see that in automotive with Tesla. And so the reason that's so exciting is that it empowers new entrants, people in the room, the entrepreneurs, the folks who see that a sea change is afoot and the normal way of doing business isn't that the big get bigger and it's stasis, right? So that's another way to think about it. Like, if it weren't for disruptive change, big get bigger, business as usual, that's a moniker that actually means something. And this is the antithesis of that. Catalytic change is when you fund some entrepreneur that can make the change happen. You know, it could be a philanthropic entrepreneur or for business. Now, as we have looked at this in, let me just remind myself where I wanted to go next with that, just one sec. Oh, right. So as an investor in this, we've also seen a profound shift in who's investing in these kinds of companies, right? So 10, 15 years ago, I was a little bit of a loner. There weren't a whole lot of the venture firms I could turn to invest in radical new things, be that nuclear fusion or electric cars or rockets. These are all perceived as really bad ideas. And actually, I was openly lambasted by mainstream venture capitalists in the press as doing exactly the sort of thing they're not going to do, be so distracted by these crazy little projects. And I think I've seen a profound change in the last few years, both in psychedelic science funding as well as all these other things. Like just yesterday was announced $2 billion has been invested in a nuclear fusion company that we helped to get started. And that would have not been fathomable to me. I think what's happening is, A, people want to make a difference in their life. They want to invest in things that actually improve the world, not just some ad network. And B, they want to, in instance, follow with what they see as the incredible wealth creation of a company like Tesla. So I think there's an umbrella effect where you see big projects to change the world for the better actually succeeding, and they're investing all in droves in these areas in private markets. So specifically, it's public market investors, groups like Tiger, who used to be late stage, groups like Bailey Gifford and Fidelity and others who you think of as public market investors moving downstream into the kinds of businesses that we typically invest in en masse. In fact, some recent analysis by the Wall Street Journal was that the majority of venture funding for startups not only was with these alternative groups, these non-venture groups. In fact, most of the funding rounds had no venture capitalists in them whatsoever. Which is a fascinating watershed moment. It's not just like VC leads, corporate follows, or some pension fund or what have you. So really big change. We're seeing that in our LP base. It's largely people who care, and we see it in the companies that they invest in. Like hundreds of millions of dollars for the companies we invest in, coming from individuals, family offices, CEOs, people who are, frankly, real people we know that care about the future, as opposed to institutions that have some sort of formulaic investment criteria. So let me end with one last example, Planet Labs, which was mentioned in the introduction. Company I'd known for about a decade when they first got started. To give you an example of how these new startups look. So when they got started and we first invested, they weren't incorporated. They weren't yet a company because they weren't sure they wanted to be a company. There was this new thing at the time, a decade ago, called a B Corp, Benefit Corp. And they were doing deep dive into, should we be a B Corp? In the end, they weren't sure how other investors would look at it. So we decided, well, let's just do 10-to-1 voting for the founders instead. This is the simple way to, guarantee that your founder leads a company is give them 10 times as many votes, right? And hope they're going to be a shepherd of the mission, right? As sort of a leap of faith. That's why you do it. Well, that worked, and the company's about to go public next week, but they're converting now into a PBC, Public Benefit Corp, much like MAPS is organized. And it's kind of fascinating. I spoke with the guy who's leading this charge, one of the founders of Planet. This is his entire focus, which is the nonprofit side, the mission, if you will. Which they're an Earth satellite company. They've launched more satellites than anyone else. They image the Earth every day, a raster scan. So they provide transparency on illegal fishing and logging and you name it, right? So nonprofits use them extensively. And they really want to help accelerate humanity's sustainable and secure and prosperous future. That's their mission statement. But to be a PBC, very interestingly, they have to actually come up with specific metrics. They're going to be baked into the audit committee guidelines for what they measure as much as they measure their financials. Those metrics will be the basis of the entire compensation system for the company. And it's a very interesting opportunity, which, as I asked him about it, he said, we think business can be the greatest lever for social change out there. He believes greater than anything that philanthropy has achieved. Now, I was taken aback by that, I must admit, as a philanthropist, and I did some Googling online, like, what are the greatest hits of philanthropy? And almost everything I could find was healthcare related, right? Which relates, of course, to psychedelic science as well. Things like eradicating smallpox, polio vaccines, you name it, a lot of good work, AIDS vaccines, cystic fibrosis, it goes on and on. In fact, of the multi-billionaire donors of the world, over half of their donations are going to healthcare-related initiatives. They want to cure something that maybe afflicted a family member. So it is an enormous vector of capital on the nonprofit side. He believes even more can be done in the for-profit side if you are one of these new kinds of things. He doesn't like to call it post-capitalism because that's not very inclusive. It's more just the natural evolution he thinks of capitalism. Back to my earlier points about Tesla, SpaceX, and others, the companies that do this will actually outcompete others. Right? Planet is bigger than all of its competitors combined. 6 of their competitors went public in the last year, and they're bigger than all the rest combined. They're the only one that has this messianic mission to make the world a better place and to align the company around it. Lastly, I'll say, if you don't align your mission with your business model, you end up looking like Facebook. You have this massive dissonance, right? Connect all the world's people. Everyone understands the mission. Wait, we can make money off advertising, and how do we do that again? And so what are the symptoms? You have to pay your employees a whole lot more to keep them. Customers are confused, employees are confused, governments start to hate you. You really don't feel proud about what you've accomplished if your mission and your business model don't align. So that's just an important addendum. You can't just like layer a mission onto a business that's not doing well for the world. So with that, I'll end to say I think business is important. I think it's one of the tools in the toolkit for catalytic change. I think you're going to see more and more of these companies forming because there's more and more capital available than we've ever seen in the venture business. Like it is just, I mean, Tim can say it is just pouring out of every orifice, left, right, and center, from startup to SPAC. And not just, like, I might say maybe 2 orders of magnitude more than I've ever seen before. And so that bodes well for everyone who's trying to lead a change that involves financing. So I think money is available. And I see time is up, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Great point on the business model is the first principles physics of a lot of these organizations. We'll revisit that in the Q&A. Last but not least, we have Joe Green, co-founder and president of PSFC, co-founder and chairman of Treehouse Co-Living. Joe is co-founder and president of the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative, a community of philanthropists that support research on psychedelic treatments and access to psychedelic healing. Joe is a dear friend, has done a lot for the space. And Joe, we're excited to have you chat about the role of philanthropy in surveying the landscape of psychedelic medicine.
Are these 2 mics going to fuck with each other? We'll see. So I did some slides. Can be a fun change, I guess. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Kevin. I've been working in the field. We started PSFC in 2017, and this is my first time speaking at a psychedelic conference, and you'll get to hear from me today and Saturday, so hopefully you'll be tired by the time that's over. So I wanted to start by just sort of contemplating the question of like, why are we here? Not like fully existentially, but why are we here in this room? Like, why do we need to have a business meets values gathering? And I think there's probably a bunch of different flavors on this, but I would just say for me, and I think we probably all would agree with the statement that psychedelics are different. And for me, the way I think about it is that this is this weird thing where the mystical meets the medical. And in fact, in a lot of the research, especially with psilocybin, you see that you seem to need to have a mystical experience in order to have a medical therapeutic outcome. And so to me, that kind of distills like, why do we kind of feel this sensitivity around the way that capital interacts with psychedelics, that it feels like this sort of special thing? I have also told people in the field that it's probably mission creep for psychedelics to like fully revolutionize capitalism, but maybe we'll see. So this is our mission statement at PSFC, although Tim basically said it. So we're a group, we have 87 members, we're a small group. Steve and his wife Genevieve there, who I'm speaking with on Saturday, are two of our initial members. We've raised $42.4 million in philanthropic funding for the space. And our members, who consist of, I would say, the vast majority of the larger philanthropists in the space, have themselves given over $100 million, in addition to what we've sort of taken on directly. So I just want to do like a very quick history of the funding, right? So the 50s and 60s era, there was actually a lot of government funding at the time. Bill Richards, who's speaking somewhere else in the building, was running the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, which had money from the Maryland State Legislature. Then you had the Dark Ages, and then from the kind of beginning of the psychedelic renaissance until very recently, it's all been philanthropic funding. Like there was nothing else. And then in the last few years, you've seen this rapid influx of private investment, and excitingly, in the last couple of years, your first very small government grants, even one from the National Institute for Drug Abuse, which is pretty exciting. So this is just some overview of psychedelic philanthropy by the numbers. I won't read through them all, but I do want to point out that MAPS will probably get through phase 3 funding, as we know, for the first ever psychedelic therapy approved by the FDA for something around $100 million from kind of start to finish over a very long, several decades. And that's actually not that much money. I mean, it sounds like a lot of money, but the average pharma company spends about $1 billion getting through that same process. And so I think there's often the stereotype that nonprofits are less efficient than for-profits, but in this case, we've seen the pioneer also actually be quite efficient with capital. And then I'll just put up some of the kind of summary of kind of the for-profit world, which is like, there's a bunch of money floating around, which you all know. So I kind of want to talk about what are the things going forward that need to be done by nonprofit, and what are the things that there's probably good reason for nonprofit to do, although it still could be also done by for-profit. And I'm going to go through these kind of sequentially 3 priorities. So legal access, right? That's the first thing. If there's no legal access, nothing else happens. And one of the things if there's one thing I'm sort of here to say at the conference over and over again is that I think we're at this moment where a really big pivot needs to happen, which is for about 30 years, kind of off in the distance was this idea that maybe the FDA will approve a psychedelic, right? Maybe there will be legal access. And now it's like around the corner. So we've had, as you guys know, MAPS, the first phase 3 trial. The vast majority of our funding at PSFC has gone towards this, with the Capstone campaign last year, which we raised about we raised $30 million to finish the phase 3 trials. And then a second legal access route sort of appeared out of nowhere. Tom Eckert is here. We're going to get to hear from him on Saturday, which was this ballot initiative in Oregon. And I think many of us thought that the political route was sort of pretty far off in the distance, but he believed, and David Bronner jumped in and he believed and kind of got the rest of us to believe. And for $5.5 million in political spending, we passed this ballot initiative. Graham Boyd, my partner at PSFC, ran the political effort. Many of our PSFC donors were also donors to the political effort. And I just kind of want to point out that you all should be paying a lot of attention to Oregon. And I don't think people are paying enough attention to it, which is if you are an entrepreneur or an investor, you can pilot basically anything you want in Oregon with psilocybin. If you're interested in psilocybin, interested in classic psychedelics, and it's a model that's not a medical model. It'll be regulated. You'll have to be licensed as a guide, licensed as a clinic, and licensed as a psilocybin producer, one of those 3. But it does not require a diagnosis. For PTSD, for MDMA, you're going to need a diagnosis. In Oregon, anyone who's healthy and does not have difficult conditions like schizophrenia, for example, will be able to go and I'm Jewish, I could have a Yom Kippur psilocybin group experience totally legally in Oregon. You could have end-of-life hospice care. So I just really think wellness retreats is really worth paying attention to. We think, it's a very, very rough estimate, that for about $100 million, we could do 25 states and about 2/3 of the US population through a combination of ballot initiatives and legislative efforts. And I want to point that out because that's about the cost of a phase 3 trial. And so I think, and that's not to say that there's not amazing work happening in FDA with psilocybin and other compounds, but in terms of speed and broadness of access, there's now these two horses in the race. And 2 years ago, there really was not this, this policy route. And so I really want us to sort of orient towards 2023. This is kind of the big pivot, which is delivery of care. We've spent so much effort getting access that I think people have lost track or forgotten that these things are coming. Oregon is going to happen. The ballot initiative passed. It should be available at the beginning of 2023. Hopefully, and we think very likely later in that year, MDMA will be approved by FDA. And all the interesting questions get answered about how does care actually get delivered. So MAPS is going to play a huge role in care delivery as the first mover. They're going to set a lot of the standard of care. And I want to point out that their model, and I'm on the board of MAPS, is this nonprofit model that's going to allow profits to flow back into patient access, back into the psychedelic ecosystem. And as some of you guys have heard about, and I know Ryan Zur is sitting right here, we have this regenerative financing mechanism for commercialization, which is the first time MAPS is going to take in money that will have a return, but it's structured in a way that gives a lot back to the space and is very impact focused. So there's pieces of care delivery that basically have to happen by nonprofits. So, and many of these we're working on. So you need as happens in the rest of the medical profession, you need a certification board, you need a professional association. That's how standards get set, that's how insurance makes decisions, that's how bad actors are held to account. We need to train therapists, a whole lot of therapists. We did a report with BCG and Dan Grossman, I see in the back of the room. They estimated that we're going to need, in the next 10 years, something between 50 and 100,000 psychedelic therapists, which is like 15% of the mental health workforce. It's a lot of people that have to get trained. And we also need to do research on how to actually optimize treatment. One of the things we're particularly focused on is the VA system, which for a bunch of reasons has the ability to be a pioneer. A lot of insurance will follow the VA, and we have been funding and continuing to fund research inside of the VA system, including here at the Bronx VA, which will provide the evidence within the system for them to decide to cover. And if the VA decides to cover, basically everybody else will as well. If we want to have equitable access, certainly insurance coverage is huge, but also having patient access programs, really encouraging all the different actors in the system to make available the care affordably. And I think especially, and I know this is something Rick is very committed to, is treatment in developing countries. There's a lot of trauma around the world, and most of those places will never be able to pay anything close to market price. And so it's really important that we can use a bunch of our profits for that. And then there's the broader psychedelic ecosystem that continues to need support. So academic research centers. I mean, even just 4 years ago when I was getting started in this, there were no academic research centers. Now it seems like one's popping up every month or two, which is just an amazing sign of how mainstream this is getting. And finally, it's worth mentioning, more than worth mentioning, some of the broader ecosystems. So support for indigenous knowledge holders to protect natural plants and natural healing systems. RiverStyx and Bronner's have been a huge part of that, and they're here. I think another important piece that MAPS is also working on, and Fireside and others, is about integration and peer support. Like, I think probably most of us in this room have friends who use psychedelics. I would venture to guess, could be wrong. There's a lot of people who are gonna have their first psychedelic experience and they're not going to know anybody who has ever taken a psychedelic. And after they're done with their formal therapy, how are they going to go back to their wife, to their church, to their friends, and talk about what many will say is the most important experience of their life? And it's really important to have these peer support groups. And finally, public relations and public advocacy. Like, we've seen this long holiday of positive press for psychedelics. That will turn at some point. And we need to be ready, and there's a lot of important work that's being done, and we really think the whole ecosystem needs to contribute back to. So that's who we are. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, guys. That was fantastic. We can go into a bit of a moderated Q&A now. I've got some questions prepared. We'll also open up the audience. I think we're running about, what, 10 minutes behind? We still have a good 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Yeah, for sure. Okay. So if there's one thing I hope you've taken away from this is that there is a wide spectrum of available types of models for investment and ways to build businesses in this area. And let's not limit ourselves to false dichotomies of for-profit, nonprofit, venture capital, or philanthropy. You know, there's a huge spectrum of these. And one resource I encourage you to take a look at, purposeeconomy.org has a whole handbook on a wide range of types of governance structures for corporations. This whole exercise, this work has caused me to go look at the history of corporations. It wasn't always just shareholder capitalism with 5 old rich white dudes on the board. It's actually been vastly different. I encourage you to look at this because there's so many different pools of capital. And with these models that we're pioneering, it opens up the funnel to lots of funder types. There's a lot of money out there, a lot of different kinds. So with that, as investors, we often have the most leverage when we're investors and funders. We have the leverage on dictating what happens with that money. I'm curious, are there things you do in how you might govern differently? Whether the terms you use before, during, after the funding, how you manage the founders' organizations with the money you put in carries the catalytic portion through with that funding. Yeah.
I could.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So I think it's kind of like the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. I think the most important thing we do is to not be an activist investor in mindset or demeanor, saying we're going to run your business or tell you what to do. And so it's almost the opposite, the white space of giving them the freedom to run with their mission. So we would be disingenuous of investing in purpose-driven, founder-led businesses to not let them do that. And so we never seek control on the board. We never seek control in an investment term with a company. We try to help coach them through avoiding that when other investors ask for it. And related to support this long-term mission, we set up our fund as a 15-year fund, where most venture firms are 10-year.
So you stretch the timeline out.
Yeah,
to relieve
stretch the
some of
timeline
the time
out.
pressure.
And we told all of our investors, like, don't even expect that you would be exiting our investments. We would hope that you would hold in perpetuity in some cases if you believe in the mission. That's what I try to do personally. And so I think the main thing is pushing the burden to the front end. You believe that that founder has a true, dream to change the world for the better, and that's what's driving them. Not that they're an arbitrage-seeking opportunist that's trying to fake it. Like, oh yeah, that's what I need to do to get funding, so I'll pretend like I care. And there's a series of questions you have to do at the front end, I think, to really judge and discern. Do you trust that that you're going to just bet it all on them? And frankly, that's been the best way I found as a venture capitalist.
Steve, you raised a really good point. There's also a management of where your sources of capital come from, setting their expectations. Because if they come in with business as usual, it's going to be, I want to see my IRR, I want to see my big returns, I got a short time frame. So does that mean you sometimes choose different investors for yourself, pools of capital?
Yeah, thanks for the follow-up. I left that out. That actually, I had the blessing in retrospect to start a new firm about 2.5 years ago, because I got kicked out of my old firm, so I had to, and start over with a non-compete clause, which means I couldn't talk to any of the investors. So I didn't start with the that I should try an entire new investor base, but it ended up that way, and I couldn't have been happier. That everyone, we have over 100 LPs, they're all CEOs, people I know, other investors, people who have real names, and that's a person who cares about the future, and they understand the long-term mission. They aren't what I call a protocol droid, at some pension fund. It's what is the, whatever ratio. And so it's so much better. And I can imagine the same is true for entrepreneurs. It's when you got this investment bank type person versus someone who cares as deeply as you do about your mission, that's the investor you want.
Very good. Any others want to jump in on that? I'm just curious on sort of the, whether it's, how you govern the energy you apply with your money to those that you fund, as well as your own sources of funding and managing those pools, and how you do it maybe differently.
Maybe I'll just say it's a privilege when impact investing, when the limited kind of partners, if you will, are foundations and philanthropically oriented from the get-go, because they're putting capital in an investment, trying to be catalytic in service oftentimes to their program or their missions as an organization. So it's already oriented and aligned from the beginning. And one thing I think that the RiverStyx Foundation, Dr. Bronner's do that maybe is rare, but they through even the due diligence process, they take a supportive role, being at service to the entrepreneurs. So it's finding good founders and good teams and putting a lot of trust and building that rapport to be ready to serve. And so we try and bring whatever advice or, over a decade in this industry, RiverStyx Foundation, building up relationships and brings that to bear to offer that to the entrepreneurs. Not everybody has to take it, but we can make that avail that to the teams.
Yeah, Bobbi.
Yeah, I love that aspect of actually helping entrepreneurs understand what it is that they need to do to actually be able to scale. In the case of Pivotal Growth, the way that we have set it up is there's three board trustees and working with them, but as a separate governance, in terms of governance entity, are a group of investors that are actually directly investing in the field. So they're actual subject matter experts. And so the Board of Trustees will help with the basic due diligence, but it's up to the investment committee to make the decisions and report back to the board. So in that way, we have people that are actually experts in the field making the decisions rather than investment managers that have no clue around that. So that's how we separate the governance out.
So here's a more tougher question, but how far will you take this? Are there certain business models and practices you just will not fund? Are there exit types you'll prohibit? For example, the Toronto Stock Exchange money grab, a quick IPO, or an ICO and tokenization. I'm really curious, are there certain models or practices you find that just don't work for this field and that you won't touch? Taking patents and things like that.
Illegal arms trading? I don't know, what's like a really easy answer?
Well, this is a tough one. We have a rule of thumb to not invest in anything that preys on human frailty. So we do have the, no gambling, no guns. I think most venture firms do. But the tough one can be products that are overly addicting. And an easy one would be we'd never invest in Juul. We had the opportunity to. We watched billions of dollars go away, as an investment that we didn't pursue. The one that's, I would just say, on the edge for us, one where we lean against, is frankly cannabis, which I know is very controversial to say in this audience, but we want the net good to vastly exceed the harm that can ensue. And so that's what we look for in investment. We don't tend to constrain, though, on the business type. It's usually a corporation, frankly, in our business.
Yeah, that's something I've been asked before, because you brought up a good question about, for example, a Facebook business model. At Mayfield, I've gone as far as say I will not look at free ad-based business models. It's just fundamentally unethical because it pits customer interests versus end-user interests orthogonally. And I wonder, will we see those tensions in this field? For example, a business model based on number of doses you give out. Well, if you add scale pressure to that, what are you going to do? You're going to push as many doses as you can, right? So I'm really curious to see, will there be certain models that just don't make sense in this space over time too? Yeah. Great. Let's open it up to the audience if there's any questions.
We have time for 4 brief questions.
No, I'm always brief. Oh, can I hold it? I really need to. Fine. I'll give you a New York minute. Hello, my name is Jade Natanya Ullman. I just want to acknowledge everyone in this room. I am an enthusiastic person. I got to work with MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.org, give generously, like many of you on stage. This one is for you, Rabbi Joe. First of all, Chag Sameach. We're here in Hanukkah, and I just want to say briefly, I apologize. I'm usually quicker if I can hold my own mic. But with that, can I hold it or no? You know, okay, fine. Okay, can I hold it? Okay. Can I hold it? May I hold it? Okay, sorry. Can I touch you at least? I just don't want to get too close to you. I'm sorry. I just wanted to just save my question. My question is, just super quick. I am a person who gave a planned gift. That means that when I die, God forbid, should it be soon, I gifted $1 million to MAPS. It's based on a percentage. I think that philanthropy is way more easier to give because I don't want to say I don't expect anything. I actually do expect something. When one gives an investment, it doesn't have to be to Joe or anyone on this panel, might MAPS need $1 million, God forbid, soon, but let's just say, Tim, I know these people very well, might you advise me as a philanthropist to give a planned gift? Would you advise me as a philanthropist to give more investments? What are your thoughts on this question? Thank you for having me. And thank you, Kevin Faltic.
I'd love to answer that one. I'm so glad you brought that up because as someone who does work with all kinds of folks to think about what they're doing with their money, I've noticed that a lot of people really put the bucket of philanthropy very separate from the bucket of investing, and their expectations of what they're going to get from their investments are vastly different from what their expectations are from their philanthropy. And so we just really encourage people to think of it more as a continuum. There are so many amazing causes out there that are looking for investments and not necessarily philanthropy. And so instead of, it doesn't necessarily have to be a zero-sum game, but, don't feel like every investment you make has to be quote unquote market rate. What if, like I know someone who says, I want my investments to make a negative 20% return because she is someone who was born with a lot of wealth. She inherited a lot of wealth, and she feels that she wants to give it away over her lifetime. But if you make a donation, your return is negative 100%. You might say it's a little bit less than that. It's like a little bit more than that, like negative 80% because you get a tax break. But what if instead you made an investment where you only lost 20%? You're making more money than you do on a donation, and you're able to support businesses that may not be able to pay a market rate return, but are doing so much good in the world. So, and there's for example, the business I mentioned in the very beginning of my talk, the grocery store, they're paying a 3% annual return. Is that market rate? Probably not, but it's an amazing business. And if you invest in that, you're going to get a much higher return than any return you would get on a donation. So I really encourage people to be a little more fluid in how they think about what they're doing with their money.
Let me try to answer also. I think I heard you ask Jade about sort of how to think about your philanthropic gifts and also whether to kind of stage them out over time. The way that at PSFC we've approached this is trying to figure out what we think are going to be a very small number of sort of catalytic things that will happen. Like that's why we put so much effort behind the MAPS capstone campaign. Is it was just for us, there's all of this stuff happening, but unless the first psychedelic, MDMA, gets through the FDA, like nothing else will happen. And so, and now what is going to reach patients the most quickly, right? So there is a massive spread between MAPS getting approved and having a small amount of delivery of care funding versus a lot on how many patients they could reach. Could they reach 5,000 patients or millions of patients? Like both of those outcomes are possible. And so for us, it's about, and then diving in deep, and we've taken an approach where we have brought in experts, and instead of just doing diligence from the outside, we brought in a guy named Jason Pyle, who will be around the conference. If anyone you've met is one of the more impressive people you'll meet. And he came in initially to do diligence for us, ended up joining the MAPS Public Benefit Corp board in a very, so we're approaching that in a collaborative way, not, because we're not like, which of these 10 things that's almost in phase 3 of psychedelics are we going to support? Because there's really only one. And so the assessment is like, are they likely to be successful or not? And then how can we help make them as successful as possible?
Great.
And I'll just add, I think it comes down to your risk appetite and what you're willing to put to work. In my humble opinion, there's a greater risk of not doing right now than there is of doing. So I would highly recommend putting money to work in an entity that you really believe in. You asked about what we don't invest in. There's a lot of stuff we won't invest in. We screen out a lot of stuff. For me, it's around having a net positive impact on the planet, because that's just smart investing, in my opinion. So I think it boils down to that. Thank you.
Great. I think next audience question.
Okay. Hello, I'm Bob Wolf from Cluster Busters, a patient organization. I'll try to be brief, but there's going to be a little background here before I get to the couple of quick questions. So what I'm hearing a lot of today is, and yesterday was, we have a very special and effective medicine, but you can only get it from me. I will decide how much of this wonderful medicine you will be able to get and when you can get it. The problem with that is you need to, or to solve that issue is you need to involve the patient community, sometimes referred to as consumers in this room, from the very beginning, when you start to build these new companies. And there are peer support groups right now that exist that are waiting to hear from new peers. So I've been doing this for 20 years. One of the things that I hear from doctors in our space all the time is they were trained by the best and they have nothing to learn from the patients. What ends up happening is doctors that come to our conferences find out that they have a lot to learn from patients. And they keep coming back year after year. One thing that they learned is that every patient is different. So in our space, the chronic pain space of migraine and cluster headaches, there's 40 million people, 40 million different stories and different treatments. Once again, I just want to make the point about including the patient voice from the very beginning. It's essential in doing this correctly. You're trying to merge a new health system with a broken health system. I see a real problem in bringing the commercial end in and making concessions to the existing system, which will hurt the availability of these drugs to everyone and in a diverse manner. So my couple of questions are these companies going to be willing to involve patients from the very beginning, building the foundation? And are they willing to make the fight that need to be done to get proper care for everyone? An example would be, real quickly, on protocol design. Yeah. Okay.
So we're at time. Those are good questions. I want to give panelists a chance to respond to that. Are those mandates you ask companies that you fund or invest in to provide even up front?
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the, not to just keep waving the MAPS flag, but I think it's one of the great things about MAPS's model, right, is that all of the profits flow back into the nonprofit. And, you know, when we're sitting around the MAPS boardroom hatching evil psychedelic schemes, we're always talking about patient access and quality and really putting a lot of thought and effort into how do we balance these two things that are hard to balance, right? On the one hand, how do you make sure that people have high quality therapists? You know, there's sort of this fear of like, you can kind of have blood on your hands either way. Like if somebody doesn't have a good enough therapist and they have a bad outcome, but also if the therapist standard is too high and somebody isn't able to get treatment. You know, there's 22 veterans who kill themselves every day. There's this really, really hard balance to think about and how you go between those. But I think MAPS, by having this model, like our fundamental metric is like, how many people are we treating with what level of quality?
Yeah, and I'll just add the same with Enthea, and we're working very closely with MAPS around the commercialization plan. So that is our focus. And I just want to honour that you've put 20 years of your life into this, so thank you. And also, Jade, thank you for your contribution to this sector. And, well, obviously to Rick, that goes without saying, but Jade, thank you for your contribution to this sector too. I just wanted to note that.
I think we have time for one more question. I've been asked to be the hard-nosed moderator and focus, please, on the question and minimal background.
Hi, good afternoon. I'll try to keep this very brief. So you've talked about the capital models really along a spectrum of, let's say, philanthropy on one side, pure financial on the other side. You can think about the metrics like return on investment, return to society as two metrics that vary along the spectrum. So my question is actually a different one. Do you think in this space there's actually room, and I think about this at institutional capital, not individuals, for pure financial investors from an institutional capital point of view in this space? And typically that's been the more efficient methodology for intermediating capital. Or do you feel this space really requires more of a spectrum approach, that really putting pure financial investors, institutional investors to pour that kind of capital in is inconsistent with what this space needs to develop and grow?
Yeah, guys, what do you think? This is a key issue. Is are we a niche? Are we
I think so.
rounding error? Or
if you think about these purpose-driven businesses, and the point I was trying to make, there are plenty of investors in Tesla, right, who open sourced their patents and said we want to help the entire auto industry, catalyze change, right? So catalytic finance, so you don't make your patents open source usually as a business decision. So I think the steely-eyed, money-grabbing, greedy as hell, investor-only types, absolutely, but they will probably go to companies that are public, that may be public benefit corps. I think groups like Atai going public, Planet, I meant, not Atai. Planet going public and attracting all kinds of investors from across the political spectrum and all different types, both traditional financial types as well as family offices, is sort of indicative of the future. People are embracing the desire to make a difference, and they want to do so, whether it's ESG investing or just plain up, finance maximization. I personally believe that if they focus on companies that are going to do good for the world, they will make more money. And the irony of trying to just look for money-making opportunities as your primary goal is it's self-defeating.
if you guys want to create new models, make sure what's happening with MAP's PBC funding is successful, guys. If they get this right, it is a fundamentally new landmark model that will influence the entire space. All right. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the audience for some great questions. Appreciate it.